Having good advisors is key, right? But I would say that working with advisors who really understand the sector and know what they're doing is key, because they also won't spin the plates. You know, they've seen it before. There's a tension between wanting to minimize cash spend in the early days. There's some areas where it's really worth investing because they are things which can be hard to fix later on. One of the things that we often see is a company might get to even a Series B stage before they've really looked at what am I building, what will I be selling, where will I be selling it, how am I going to do that, what are the regulatory issues associated with that, and do I have freedom to operate? And you don't want to have taken in a whole heap of investment and spent a whole heap of money to find out 3 or 4 years into it that you've got problems with any of those things.
Hey everybody, this week delighted to be joined by Sophie McGrath, who is partner in global law firm Goodwin's Life Sciences, Healthcare and Technology Groups. Sophie is co-chair of their European Healthcare Initiative and of its Women's Health and Wellness Initiative, and has 20 years experience focusing on transactions in the life sciences, healthcare and technology sectors, acting for companies at all stages of development and their investors. Sophie, delighted to have you on. Welcome to Healthtech Podcast. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm very well, thank you.
Good. Whereabouts are you speaking to us from today, Sophie?
I'm in London, where the sun's shining, even though it's the beginning of February, so that's making a nice change.
Does make a nice change. Remarkable how many people talk about the weather on this from the UK. Of course,
right.
when you go to the US, it's just glorious all the time on the West Coast. So never get to speak about it with the US people, which is probably a good thing. But anyway, yeah, listen, delighted to have you on. I was saying before, I think you're probably the first lawyer practicing law that hasn't gone into entrepreneurship that I've had on the Healthtech Podcast. So it's nice to actually, it'd be nice to talk about some legal stuff for health tech and biotech companies and founders, and advice and information, because it's a part of growing a company that certainly I was a little bit blindsided by, the requirement for it, because you can go into company building quite naive, thinking that everyone is good-willed, everyone wants to do the right things, everyone's going to act on the right side of the law at all times, and everyone's going to pay on time, everyone's going to obey contracts as if because why wouldn't you? But obviously none of those things are true whatsoever. So yeah, delighted to have you on to talk about some good legal hygiene of building a company, but also because of the investment side of the world that you work on, talking about how you see that lie of the land and what things are like and how companies do grow and finance themselves to exit with all the multiple things that they can do. So looking forward to getting into all of that with you. But first, it'd be good to hear about you. So why does a lawyer choose to work in health tech and biotech? Tell us a bit of your story.
Yeah, so I don't know if you picked up from the accent, but I'm Australian. I moved to the UK over 20 years ago now for a 3-month secondment with the
Amazing.
law firm I was working for at the time.
Where the weather is much better in.
Well, quite. So, I mean, this is why I appreciate the sun. But yeah, stage. So stage. And don't regret that. I really enjoy living and working in the UK. I think it's a fantastic place to be, particularly for people working in life sciences and healthcare. You know, lots of great innovation in the UK. So that's been great. I, out of law school, worked for an American law firm as my sort of first job out of law school, and have ever since. Apart from a short stint at a UK law firm. So my entire career really has been at US law firms, originally by accident, but then by design because of the types of sectors I work in. You know, these companies need to scale. They need access to capital, which goes beyond the European borders. You know, most of them will require US capital in either private or public forms at some point. And also the US, of course, is a huge homogenous market for health tech and biotech products. So a very important market to the sector. So eventually I formed the view that to be able to properly service these companies, I needed to be on a on an international platform. And the interest in healthcare and life sciences really comes from the fact that my father is a doctor and my mother was a nurse.
Oh, wow.
And I grew up then not wanting to be a doctor, having watched how
I was going to say, how
hard
did
he
you get
worked.
away with not going into medicine?
Yeah, exactly. I was given three options really: medicine, law, or engineering.
Oh, the classic,
And
the big three. Yeah.
we had no lawyers in the family, so I had no one to disabuse me of the notion that it wasn't
Amazing.
that it was going to be just as hard as medicine. Although I still think probably not. Doctors work extremely
in different
hard,
ways.
particularly
In different
doctors who
ways, I
work in
think.
the public system. So I ended up being a lawyer. Which in fact, I've enjoyed very much. I enjoy working with, the people I work with, and by that I mean the people in the companies. Incredibly clever, motivated, driven people trying to solve really big issues. It's a privilege to be able to work with those people. It's intellectually challenging, and it's given me the opportunity to work on a global basis in sectors that I'm really interested in. So I feel fortunate.
Amazing. So, talk to me about exactly what you do for clients. So, your clients, as you said, are health tech and biotech companies. What stage do you work with? And I guess what do they require of you at different stages?
Yeah, so we work with companies at all stages in their life cycle. So even from pre-incorporation, founders will come to us with an idea. They won't yet have a company. They might not even have the technology yet. They might be in licensing some of it from either a strategic or a university, or they're developing it themselves, or a mix of all of the above.
With an idea they want to protect, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So we will start very early, and then we do everything through to acting for very large listed companies. And I think seeing both ends of that journey is really important. It informs the way that you advise across that spectrum. I think we're very expert at understanding proportionality and pragmatism. What's appropriate for a global listed company is not necessarily what a seed financed company needs to be doing, and we can have that conversation. We can also have the conversation about what is this going to look like when you are that global listed company. And within my team, so I'm a corporate lawyer, and I focus on financing as well as the scale up of these companies and their exit, which sometimes involves exits to the US public markets. But within my team, we have people who focus on all the different things that these companies would need. So IP, licensing, patent protection, employment, the equity incentive arrangements that we put in place for these companies, cross-border tax advice, M&A, public markets lawyers, what regulatory lawyers, absolutely everything you could imagine that companies in these sectors might need. There are other people within the team who I bring in, depending on the different needs of the companies.
Yes. So you mentioned quite a lot of things there, but what I want to draw attention to, first of all, you talked about equity and incentive structure, patents, regulatory. And it's interesting because if you talk to a seasoned founder, they automatically just know the gravity of the decision making, particularly around, let's just say, initial equity split between founders or something like that. Something which a first-time entrepreneur might go, oh, there's two of us 50-50. You must see quite a lot of issues as they develop through a company's life cycle, given that you see people right at the beginning all the way through to right at the end. When it comes to things like equity split, incentives, even patent or regulatory, can you think about these types of things too early? Are these the sorts of things that people should be getting done early? What are the lessons for people early in their entrepreneurship careers that might be first time, second time found, or let's say first time founders that may not have made mistakes before? What are the mistakes that you see? What does good legal hygiene and practice look like for an early stage founder with big ambition?
Yeah. So, I mean, this sounds like a self-serving plug.
Well, it will, by the way, and that's okay.
It will. Yeah, having good advisors is key, right? And I think lawyers who work in startup are used to helping their clients manage this tension between, we understand that the capital, the cash in that business, it's hard to raise. You want it to go into the business, into the product. So we're sensitive around fees. We don't want to be charging companies for work they don't need to do now, or taking, as I alluded to before, a sledgehammer to a nut when a more proportionate approach could be used at the stage the company's at. But I would say that working with advisors who really understand the sector and know what they're doing is key, because they also won't spin the plates. They've seen it before. They can give you a quick answer. They're not going to go off and spend hours trying to work it out because they've never seen it before. So that would be one. Two would be, I see, and again, it's totally understandable. There's a tension between wanting to minimize cash spend in the early days. But there's some areas where it's really worth investing because they are things which can be hard to fix later on. Equity incentives is an obvious one. And the main point there is get the plan set up correctly, and it's about the valuation at which you issue the equity. And if you're issuing equity to people that live in multiple different jurisdictions, making sure that you're doing that effectively.
Interesting. What do you mean by that?
They are things you often can't go back and change.
Right.
What I mean is that if you get, so I've had examples of companies, very early stage, they might have employees based in Spain, the US, the UK, and Germany, but they're only getting advice on the UK grants. And then they find that they haven't gone and got a 409A valuation in the US, and that gives rise to some problems for the US person down the line. And the basic difference there is, you're trying to get people tax incentivized options. You're trying to get this taxed as capital and not income. And so that type of stuff, it's hard to solve later, because if the valuation of the company has gone up and you find that you got it wrong, you may be forced into a situation where you have to regrant at a higher strike price. So for me, when I think about these companies, the two most important things in these companies are their people and their technology, the people and the ideas. You need to make sure that people are properly incentivized through their equity and their comp, and that they're looked after. So this goes to that pot. And then the other pot is making sure that your technology is properly protected and looked after. And again, there are ways which, without, burning the bank account, that you can do targeted looks at your IP. I would say one of the things that we often see is a company might get to even a Series B stage before they've really looked at, what am I building? What will I be selling? Where will I be selling it? How am I going to do that? What are the regulatory issues associated with that? And do I have freedom to operate? And you don't want to have taken in a whole heap of investment and spent a whole heap of money to find out 3 or 4 years into it that you've got problems with any of those things. So the earlier you can sort of look ahead and just understand that landscape, the better.
So can you give me an example of, I guess, those streams of work or when you would do them? So is it like in the run up to a Series A or a Series B, for example? Are you plotting with that company, okay, once the Series B comes in, here's now what we're going to do here? And I guess that's then an argument for, before a raise, you should be engaging people to decide the future rather than doing the raise and then trying to retrofit everything. Is that kind of what you're saying?
From day one, and I'll take them separately, equity incentives versus the IP and regulatory piece. From day one, on equity incentives, you're looking at how you get your founders their shares in the most tax efficient manner. You're then looking at, do you need to put in place an equity incentives plan to be able to hire people, to be able to attract people? And if so, what's the right form of that plan? Where are those people going to be located? That's a conversation from day one. You might not need to put in those plans immediately, but we're looking at that on day one, and it's responsive to the company's hiring needs. So if I have two founders and they're not hiring anyone for 12 months, well, we don't need to do that work. We don't need to go to that expense yet. We need to make sure that the founders' shares are properly issued, but we don't necessarily need to put in an option plan. So that piece is driven by the specific company and what their hiring needs will be and where they're operating. A similar analysis on the IP and regulatory, and both of these things are, of course, iterative. As the company grows and develops its thesis and its product, and you more, one would say, in a refined manner, or, it might pivot. Often we have to come back and look at these things again. But even on day one, we're looking at, if the company on day one knows what it thinks it has, what it wants to develop, and let's take the US, the US will almost certainly be a key market for any of these companies. On day one, we're having a conversation around, do you have freedom to operate? Is this proprietary technology or in-licensed? If it's in-licensed, can you do everything you want with it? Do you own all of that? If you sell, what's that look like? Do you have control over this in such a manner that you could IPO or exit by way of M&A? And then we're looking at the regulatory piece as well. Now, particularly in health tech, that can be quite fast evolving. I think the way AI is interfacing with health tech at the moment is a good example of that. So we have lawyers in our team who, are really deep in this stuff, keeping an eye on all that. But we're looking early on, saying, like, if you came to sell this product, who are you selling it to? How would you sell it? And what's your regulatory pathway?
This is interesting. So I interface with a lot of health tech and biotech startups increasingly, and exits are interesting, let's just say. There aren't many of them to point to. And there are things like Babylon that SPAC can almost do well and then disintegrate and disappear. There are examples of people that seem pre-IPO for quite a long time on the health tech side and never quite get there. Certain diabetes ones in the US, for example, and things like that. On the biotech side, obviously it happens. Very different to grow a biotech business, as you've said before. Like, there's less of an operating business within there and more on ideas and value. But thinking about the exit is clearly important. And I don't know how much people truly are thinking about their exit and allowing that to dictate how they build the company. My question then is, how much should health tech founders have a certain exit in mind or options of exit in mind? And how much can that or should that influence the way they build their company and do these things that you've just mentioned?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, I was sort of just looking around to see if I could find. There is a great report by Silicon Valley Bank 2024 about the current state of health tech in terms of both financing and exits for anyone who wanted to look a bit more deeply at those statistics. And hopefully throughout this conversation, I'll find it somewhere in my office. But a couple of things. So, exit macroeconomic activity is cyclical. And so we see, particularly for equity capital markets, and, at the moment we are in a more challenging exit environment, no question about that. IPOs for new companies have been very hard to come by in 2022 and 22, 23, 24. We're seeing some activity now on the US capital markets for biotech, but it's been, a prolonged period of dampened activity for new IPO activity. M&A exits are also tricky, because just because you decide that you want to sell your company doesn't mean someone's going to buy it. As people say, companies get bought, not sold. And so, most companies we work with will have an eye on all options available to them, including increasingly staying private for longer. There are now some interesting sources of late stage capital coming from some private equity players that allow companies which maybe previously would have been looking for an IPO as that source of large capital. And in the absence of the ability to do that, other types of funding coming into the market. So that's been an interesting evolution over the last couple of years. But we see a lot of companies, no question about it, maybe more on the health tech side than the biotech side, where they're building something and they know that there's only, 3, 4, 5 players globally who really understand the space and who could acquire the technology. And I think when that's the case, you of course have to have an eye on what are they doing? What are they interested in? Making sure that you build those links with their business development teams early. Some people take the view of trying to do pilots with those organizations so they can get closer to the technology, and so that you can make sure you get firsthand feedback on any concerns they might have on the technology. But building for a specific buyer, look, there's examples of where that's worked. But I think most people come at it from, they're building something because they see a gap in the market. They see a need for it. And I think those plays are always safer, because if you develop something which really is best in class, or the new gold standard, or a step up, or does something that we currently do but cheaper and faster and quicker or better, that gives you a lot more optionality than trying to build something with a specific acquirer in mind. You don't know how their strategy changes. You don't know whether your product will be successful. You don't know whether they're potentially developing it in-house. So there's a lot of risks around that strategy, I think, of just developing something with one buyer in mind.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point, because do you notice have you noticed anything in the people that you've represented and the experience that you've got? Have you noticed anything about the ones that are really successful? Is there anything that you've spotted about the founder, the team? Is it a particular focus? Is it a particular way that they've scaled, or speed that they've scaled, or certain problem that they solved, or certain customer, or certain, do you have a feel for when someone has either approached you for representation, or you've got them under your wing and you're watching them? Is there anything that you think, hold on a minute, we've got a real winner here?
It's such a good question.
You'd be an investor if this was a clear yes, by the way, I suppose.
That's right. Well, look, I became a lawyer, so clearly I'm quite risk averse. But it's a very, very good question. I would say first, there's a huge amount of luck in all of this, right? There's a lot of right time, right place. But underpinning all of that, whatever you do, it has to work. And I know that sounds stupid and simple, but often you'll get to a point in your product development journey, and this is whether you're a health tech or a biotech, and it just doesn't work, or it doesn't work as well as you hoped it would, or it doesn't work in the way you thought it would. You can't solve for that. So I think most of the companies that really knock it out of the ballpark, I mean, they have something that works. It works really well, and it's a paradigm shift. That normally is now, the whole startup game is that you often don't know that at the beginning. You have an idea, you start working on it, you hope it will be that game-changing technology, but that's the journey. That's what you're raising money for, and you're working it out. And so you hear a lot about this fast to fail kind of approach, or doing pivotal studies or tests or proof of concepts, which allow you to work out really quickly, or as quickly as possible, whether you have serious issues with the technology. And some of them might be around, you know, if we get this to a point where it works and we can commercialize it, how do we sell the product? How do we get it to the end user? You know, really looking at that full chain of, is there anything in there which is going to mean that when we get to that point and we look at it, we fail? So trying to look forward and really strength test all that stuff as early as you can. I think very successful companies have that combination of something amazing, but they've probably also spent an awful lot of time thinking about in what ways could this fail? And they've thought about those early. I'd say the other defining feature we see, just high performing, high functioning teams. You know, ultimately it is people that drive these ideas through to execution. And I think it's a common feature of just fantastic companies that they have great teams at all levels with strong leadership.
And do you feel that how does that come across? Do you get a sense of that from the people that you interface with, whether that's general counsel or founders that say to you, we have no weaknesses in the team, we're completely happy? Is that how you know? Or do you actually see and feel it a different way?
I think you see teams, when teams are high functioning, they share ideas easily. They're normally not particularly hierarchical, although there will be leadership. You know, that it's important to share ideas, share thoughts, and certainly if things are going wrong, to not have a system whereby you can't escalate that to the right person quickly. So we won't always see that. You know, we interface normally with the C-suite, the general counsel, the CFO, the CEO, the chief technology officer, you know, a group of people. But I do think that you can get a sense of,
You'll get a sense of progress, won't you? You'll get a sense of progress across the board.
you do, and you get a sense of how plugged in those leaders are to what's happening on the coalface, and how information is getting reported back to them, and how you see them interact as a team. So, you know, often we'll sit in on board meetings, which is really interesting. And, you know, the best functioning boards are ones that share ideas well. They follow structure, but, you know, they're making sure that they really do understand what's going on in the business. They have a group of different people with different expertise around the table, and they're drawing on that. That can be a very different type of board meeting to one where you've got only one person talking or directing what people will say or when people are invited to speak. So we do sometimes see it from the sidelines. But, you know, obviously we're not in there every day. I always have huge admiration actually for the leadership teams in these organizations. It brings a whole different skill set to bear to be able to take a company from, you know, 10 people through to 100 people and beyond, and to manage that and to make sure culture stays good, lines of communication stay good, all the things that need to happen to build a successful company are on track. It's a admirable skill set.
Indeed. Meanwhile, trying to build a product and trying to raise money and do everything else, which brings me to my next point. Raising money. You describe yourself as a private investment lawyer. Now, obviously that side of it, we can talk very practically actually about the now as we sit here in February 2025. With the market how it is, you described it as more challenging than normal at the minute. With the market how it is, what are you seeing in terms of the traits of the successful that are successful now? What is it that they are doing differently? Because I think that's the question that I tend to get most out there in the space at events when I'm out and about in my DMs, which is, I get it, raising money is tough, but what can I do that is different? What is it that investors need now? Is it risk aversion? Is it path to profitability? Is it everything earlier, more traction, more commercial contracts, more that, like, what is it that can make me stick above the rest once I go to raise?
Yeah, it's a good question. So maybe sort of to look at what's happening now just with the lens of the last couple of years. This is a trend that happened in biotech as well, but very much so in health tech. So when you look back to 2020 and trailing into 2021, you had a lot of non-specialist money flowing into the healthcare
We
and
did
life
indeed.
sciences sector because of the focus on those sectors arising from the pandemic. You know, people finally, I don't think anyone understood. If I said I was a life sciences lawyer in 2018, people just used to look at me blankly. But from 2021, so 2020 onwards, that changed. I'd sort of say, oh, you know, my firm works for Moderna, and they'd get it. So yeah, things changed. I mean, your average person developed an interest in vaccine production and telemedicine because, you know, we're all sitting at home, and if we need to get our medication or see a doctor, we can't go and do that anymore. So it really, I think, changed the face of healthcare and life sciences in a very short space of time, but attracted as a result of it a lot of non-specialist income, which it has pros and cons, but I think the downside of it is that a lot of those people exited the market when things got tough in 2022. And so as a result, we had this sort of overinflated view of private financing in those years and the amount of capital that went into a lot of companies. I saw a stat in this SVB report that almost 50% of those companies that raised financing in those years haven't come back to market yet. This is for health tech specifically. Now, part of the reason is because the people they raised capital from aren't going to put more money into them. You know, they've decided that actually the sector has longer horizons, it's more risky, it's more complicated than maybe they understood. So one, I think we need to accept there's just less capital floating around than there was in those years. Although if you look at 2024, what makes me happy is that, you know, aggregate investment numbers for 24 are greater than 2019. So, you know, it's not as bad as everyone thinks, but if you're contrasting it to 2020 and 21, it looks
So it looks
horrible.
normal
But
if you
not.
remove
Like
the
if
boom
you,
and bust, it looks normal.
that's right. It does. You've still got, like, at least between 2019 and where we are now, you've got a nice upward curve. So, so we should keep that in mind. But fundraising is tough. Fundraising has always been tough for early stage companies. Funds are sitting on historic levels of capital, but you know, in order to access some of that, you do need to sometimes be at a certain stage. So, you know, if you're a completely new company, you need to be looking for sources of capital that are willing to write checks of the size that you need, which often may be very small. And that gives rise then to a smaller known universe of people who are willing to do that. And then in terms of what the investors are looking at, you know, I think it's always good for companies to really educate themselves about the specific investors they're approaching and what their themes are at the moment. What are they interested in? Sometimes they will have very tightly defined parameters around that. They'll say, oh, well, we don't do the following at all. We don't want to do that. Or we are very interested in the following at the moment. So I think understanding that's important. And then it becomes a little bit of, you know, I think they're looking for everything all at once. And so I know that there's this conversation around, oh, did we go from, you know, just pure revenue to profitability? And that's the thing that changed. And in all honesty, funds are looking for something that's going to give a return to the fund. So you've got to convince them that your company is one that can scale and return a multiple to that investor of the amount invested. Now, how you do that, how your company does that versus how the company sitting next to you does that are going to be different. You've got to think about that. If they're putting in £10 million, how are you returning them a multiple on that investment? And I think maybe not enough companies think of it in that way.
I would agree, actually. So I actually see this from the communications and marketing side, that I find that people want to put everything into a template or a cookie cutter simple answer of, okay, all the investors are looking for this, or this type of investor is looking for this, and this one is looking for this, and I've got my Sequoia 10 slide pitch deck that will go problem solution, like. And it's funny because from a comms and marketing side, it's the same advice. It's tell your story in whatever order makes the most sense to the person you are telling it to. Whether that's an investor, whether that's a customer, whether that's a partner, whether that's a user. It's design. If it's a pitch deck, okay, pitch deck, but the pitch deck again is just a visual aid to the story, and it's tell the story that can take that person through so that at the end they feel that you are of the most value. And it doesn't matter the order. It doesn't matter. And that's what's interesting. Oh, you can put this slide before this slide. It's like, no. Get that out of your mind. It's not slides. It's not specific bits of it's tell your story in the way it needs to be told that gives you the most value, because it will include things that, to your point, other companies it won't matter to them to talk about the regulatory in this amount of detail. But actually, if that's your differentiator and that's where your moat is, then actually you need to really go into detail on there, and then you need 4 slides on that in this structure rather than, some that might have a third of a single slide on it or whatever it is. So yeah, I totally hear you on that, because we definitely see it from a comms and a marketing side. I don't know about the consequences though, in terms of what you see.
Yeah, I think a similar thing. You've got to think about these institutional investors. In fact, any investor is getting hit by a high number of requests, lots of pitch decks.
Yeah.
Just help make the investor understand the company as quickly as possible. So I'd say that in terms of the first outreach. Your really long pitch decks, it might be appropriate for the follow-up meeting, but it's too much. You really need to try and distill that message about why should they be interested in you? What is your value proposition? And really, if you probably can't get that onto one page, you may have lost them. Which is not to say that, there won't be opportunities to dig into the detail later, but you've got to find a way to get your message across quickly.
So I want to talk a little bit about business models that you're seeing. And let's talk about health tech now, because biotech is a very different type of business model. But health tech, there are lots of business models in health tech. There are lots of customers in health tech, actually. And there are companies that it seems that we're in a phase where companies almost have to have multiple business models going on, or at least they're starting out with multiple business models. But I'm interested in what you've seen about the business models that are successful, even reaching that, acqui-hire, M&A, exit, or indeed, like, dare I say, IPO exit, if you see any of those on the health tech side. But what are the business models that make sense? I guess the reason I ask is because, like, we're about to see so much skinning of generative AI to do something or other in healthcare, which seems like it could have substance when we're talking about AI agents and huge agent models that are doing lots of different things, and there can be a depth to it. But I think the barrier to entry for simply skinning ChatGPT to do something menial is going to be huge. We're going to be doing this ourselves pretty soon. Like, clinicians are going to be able to do it themselves if they can't even already. And so I'm wondering, like, what are actually the business models that are working that you've seen? Like, what do you see at that larger level where you're reaching an exit? And yeah, because I just think there's a lot of noise.
I think there's 2 things. One, just to touch on that, let's touch on the AI point, and then let's talk about business models. So in health tech, I think it's important to distinguish the use of AI in a business to improve productivity and efficiency versus the use of AI in a business to assist clinical decision making.
Absolutely.
The latter is regulated, the former often isn't. It makes complete sense to use AI to sift huge data sets and to improve efficiency in whatever your data set might be. Is it a patient onboarding system, or are you a clinical development or a diagnostic company, or whatever it might be? Effectively, you're using AI to improve productivity and efficiency. I think the latter, you know, COVID was a high watermark in rapid adoption of things which had before then taken a very long time to be adopted. You know, people weren't doing telemedicine consultations. It was really hard to convince someone to do that rather than go to their GP. So, two parts to the clinical use of AI: getting doctors to trust it and getting patients to trust it, and the fact it's regulated. So, you know, we're still working through that journey. I don't have predictions about where that will go, other than to say that historically the healthcare system has been a slow adopter of technology for good reason, right? You know, the stakes are high and it's highly regulated, again, for good reason. The productivity and efficiency part of it makes complete sense. We live in a world where the delivery of healthcare services is increasingly expensive. Governments can't afford their healthcare budgets. They need to find solutions to be able to deliver healthcare to a broad range of the populace at lower costs than we currently experience. So anything that plays into that theme gets a lot of attention. But in terms of business models, again, it comes back to our conversation about what is it that makes your company special. The business model is going to be different for every different company, and it's probably going to be different in different jurisdictions that you're selling the same product into. I mean, so we hear frequently in the UK that the most important conversation for selling into the NHS is, how much will this save me? Whereas when companies go to the US, and they might then be interfacing directly with practitioners to be the customer or the person who needs to advocate to buy the product, they're saying, how will this make me more money? Um, and I hear this again and again. So, you know, different jurisdictions have different provider payer models, and you've got to work out what's the best model for selling into that jurisdiction. Whether it's the, you know, and then layer on top of this, are you a SaaS business? Are you a SaaS plus product business? Are you giving the product for free? Are you leasing the product? Do they pay for the product? Are they, you know, so where's the value? And I think that is iterative for companies. I think there's a bit of sort of suck it and see, you know, you take it out to market and you see what works. Obviously, there's a lot of peer groups, you know, so you can look at your peers and see how they're doing it. And then to your point about multiple revenue models, I think we see this already in companies that are selling multi-jurisdictionally. They might have different business models in different jurisdictions. So there's no easy answer to that one. And I think the companies that I see being thoughtful about it are mostly looking to hire in people to their teams, or they're getting advice from people who have done it before. So they're thinking, I'm going to go and hire someone out of maybe a large med device company who has sold a similar product to me globally, or managed a global sales team, and I'm going to get them in to help me work out how to do this. So that acceptance that you don't know what you don't know, and go and find someone who's done it before.
Absolutely. Can I ask you about actually doing the deal of getting investment in? I want to talk to you basically about term sheets and about you. Well, you've worked on both sides of the table here. You've worked on investor side, you've worked on investee side, startup side. What are the keys to a good deal for both parties? And what are the common pitfalls that you see where you think I guess a bad deal has been done for one or the other? I guess mainly from the view of the startups here. Yeah, I'm interested in your perspective.
Yeah. I mean, look, in the UK, we're fortunate because we have the BVCA, which stands for the British Venture Capital Association, who recently has always done this actually, but recently revamped the document suite, has gone through a consultation process with both investors and law firms who spend a lot of time doing VC work, both on the founder and the investor side, to come up with what we hope is a happy middle ground starting point for a set of financing documents.
I didn't know this. That's great.
The genesis behind that really is to drive down cost. We just can't spend a fortune doing these deals, particularly in the earlier stage deals, where you just want to get to agreement as quickly as possible. Those documents don't exist in a lot of continental jurisdictions, although we are seeing a trend to try and use the same set, but made such that they can work in places like Germany or France or the Netherlands. So I think that trend will continue, because I think everyone really ultimately wants the same thing here, right? Like, we want to get the money into the company so the company can use it, and we want everyone to have fair protection that reflects some sort of middle of the road position. I think the days of, or at least I find this unhelpful on a deal, where people talk about founder friendly or investor friendly terms. It kind of puts both people at other sides of the boxing ring, when actually we want everyone in the middle.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so, of course, terms need to be founder friendly. You 100% need your management team properly incentivized. They need a fair deal, or they're not going to do what the investor needs them to do to deliver value in the business. So I guess I find advisors who talk in those terms unhelpful. Like, I think our job is to bring people together, find a solution that's fair, and navigate towards that as quickly as possible. Keeping in mind, of course, the concerns everyone's going to have. A founder's going to have concerns around their equity. It is usual in venture capital transactions for some of that equity to be at risk if someone leaves. We want to make sure that that's not an outsized risk for the founder. Otherwise, again, they're not going to feel they've had a fair deal. They're not going to be incentivized to work in the business. But so one thing that I see go wrong, I think, is that, like, trying to deviate too far from the norm. Go to advisors who can help set the parameters for you and say, all right, well, we see a range of options that exist within this bit, but try not to go outside of it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I think you'll find that you spend an undue amount of money creating a very bespoke arrangement. Two, when you come to your next financing round, people often look at it and just go, what is that? That's not what I expected to see. That is unusual. And consequently, I don't like the look of that company. I'm dumbing that down massively. But, I think it is one of those things where maybe having followed the usual financing path and norms and structures makes it easier for someone to come and look at your company and say, great, that all looks like it's set up properly. It's exactly what I expected to see. And the only conversation now is about valuation and re-upping management. That's great. Like, that's where you want to be. You don't want to be in a world where they're like, I don't even understand how the exit model works, and I'm going to have to spend a lot of time getting to understand it. Or on a slightly different point, this is not a fundraising point, but, they go into the data room, the commercial contracts have not been well organized or recorded, or, and they find it hard to just quickly understand whether this is a company that's set up in a way that they want to invest into. Those things, again, it goes to just the number of companies looking for finance. It can sometimes be a low bar to put an investor off. So you don't want any of that stuff that you could have fixed or done correctly to put someone off. You need all of that just to be background noise so that you can focus on the things you should be: valuation, technology, incentivization.
So that's really interesting. Do you have you had much to do with spin outs? Because I know that exactly what you just talked about seems to be an issue with universities and the terms that are placed really early on by universities on people. And there's one in particular that keeps coming up that seems to be if you've even had a thought on their campus, it belongs to them. Let alone started a company with anything to do with their equipment or space, or even if you're just listening to someone from their university, they try and take equity and quite a lot of it. I mean, I'm just wondering if you've got an opinion on that, because I wonder if that's something that reaches as far as you guys even, or whether the founders actually just lose all motivation before they even raise their second round.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So a couple of things. What's interesting, especially working at an international law firm, is like we look to the US and we see how they do this. I'd say they've just got a more developed way of getting technology out of universities. And that's just because this has been going on over there for longer, right? It's not that's the only reason. They've had more time and more use cases to develop what's become quite a refined system. And there was certainly a move over there to come up with a standard form document for taking technology out of a university and into a NUCO. So to do a similar thing that we've done on the financing documents, to try and have a standardized document so that every academic institution you go to isn't presenting something different on that. The economic terms they ask for might be different, but that we had at least a good starting point for that out license. As far as I'm aware, there is a similar project on foot or underway in the UK. I can't speak for European jurisdictions, I'm not sure, but I certainly know that there have been conversations about trying to do the same thing in the UK to try and help standardize that process, because it does remain the case that it takes too long and it costs too much to get technology out of an academic setting. So it 100% is an area for improvement in the industry, I think, in the UK, that requires a conversation between all of the stakeholders. I'm not, the technology transfer officers of universities often are one or two people. They've got a huge job, and so it's not to suggest that that there's any fault there. I think it's more about coming together as an ecosystem and talking about, how do we make sure everyone's properly protected? How do we make sure everyone's properly incentivized to be doing this? And then compensated if things go well, and trying to bring some standardization to that.
Is there anything that we've missed that you want to talk about or touch on? We have covered a lot of ground, to be fair.
We have covered a lot. I think I would say to companies out there still fundraising, like, don't lose hope. Like, it has been really tough, but we see some green shoots. Remember, it's cyclical. The equity capital markets in the US are starting to open. We have seen some, at least, biotech IPOs go out this year. That market will come back again, because it does. History tells us that that's cyclical. It will come back. And when it does, it has the following impact on private capital. People invested in those companies get to exit after the lockup period and hopefully make money. And they get more confident then about reinvesting that money. And or when they're investing into later stage companies, that if an M&A didn't come up, there's the ability still for them to exit the companies. So well-functioning capital markets do have an impact on how venture capital behaves. And so I think, let's see how that landscape continues to improve this year. And then secondly, alternative sources of later stage private capital. This is a big trend. We see more and more private equity houses working out how they get exposure to healthcare and life sciences. This may at some point have an impact again on the flow of the early stage private capital, because then, even in the absence of an active public market, if you know that if you grow a company to a certain size, there are pools of capital that can come in and either take out your stake or invest or keep scaling the company, your attitude towards investing early becomes more robust. So I think when we see that private investment market soften, it's always linked to concerns about how am I going to exit this company? How am I going to grow this company? It's not about the fundamentals of the company per se.
Sophie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Incredibly practical and useful. This. I feel like I've grilled you. I've got a load of free legal advice here that I'm now just going to beam to 10,000 people that are probably going to listen to this. So it would be remiss of me not to ask you that for those people that have listened to this and thought I could do with getting some representation here, because it is day one, I'd like to get my idea protected. I'd like someone competent with me on this journey, or indeed people listening that are further down the line that like what they hear and want to get in touch with you. What's the best way for them to do so?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. You can find my details on the firm's website. So it's Goodwin, which is spelled Goodwin, Goodwin. And I'm up there, Sophie McGrath, and you can find my email and my phone number there.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you for summing up and for the positive uptick at the end, because as you quite rightly put, good businesses will still succeed. There are biotech IPOs, markets are cyclical, cut your costs, stay alive, raise when it's a little bit better maybe. So that's probably it, and make sure you check the term sheet. Cool. Sophie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, James.